Picture this. You wake up in your own kitchen, arms bound to a chair with silver duct tape, a cruel note taped to your refrigerator explaining why your own children think they have the right to hold you prisoner. That's how my Tuesday began 3 months ago, and it's the day everything changed forever. What my 3 adult children didn't realize was that while they were busy planning their little intervention to control my life, I had already set legal wheels in motion that would reshape their futures in ways they never saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Linda Morrison, and I'm 58 years old. I live in a modest 2-story house on Elmwood Avenue in Green Bay, Wisconsin, where I've spent the last 25 years raising my children and building what I thought was a loving family. I work as a senior accountant at Henderson Associates downtown, a job I've held for 12 years that finally gave me the financial stability I never had when the kids were young. My husband David passed away 5 years ago from a sudden heart attack, leaving me to navigate widowhood while my children were still finding their footing in the adult world. I never imagined that the 3 people I loved most in this world would one day see me as their biggest obstacle to financial security. But that's exactly what happened when I fell in love again. That October morning started like any other. The maple tree outside my bedroom window was shedding its golden leaves across the lawn, and I could smell the crisp autumn air through the crack in the window I always left open. I remember stretching in bed and feeling genuinely happy for the first time in years. Robert and I had been talking about taking a weekend trip to Door County to see the fall colors, and I was excited about something again. When you're a widow in your 50s, excitement becomes a precious commodity. I padded downstairs in my robe and slippers, expecting to find my usual quiet morning routine waiting for me. Coffee, toast, maybe catch up on some reading before getting ready for work. Instead, I found myself unable to move my arms. The confusion hit first. That foggy, just woke up feeling where your brain hasn't quite caught up with reality. I tried to lift my coffee mug and felt resistance. Then I tried to stand up and realized I couldn't. The kitchen chair I was sitting in had become my prison, and silver duct tape wrapped around my wrists was my captor. My heart started hammering against my ribs as I looked around the kitchen, trying to understand what was happening. Everything looked normal except for the white piece of paper taped to the refrigerator directly in front of me. The handwriting was Jessica's, my oldest daughter's familiar scrawl in thick black marker. "Mom, you're not leaving this chair until you listen to reason. We know about the wedding plans, and we're not going to let you destroy our family's future for some man you barely know. This is an intervention because we love you too much to watch you make the biggest mistake of your life. We'll be down in an hour to discuss your options. Love, Jessica, Michael, and Sarah." I read it 3 times before the words actually sank in my children. My own children had tied me up like some kind of criminal in my own home, the same kitchen where I'd made them countless meals, helped with homework, bandaged scraped knees, and celebrated birthdays. They had turned it into an interrogation room. The rage that flooded through me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Not the quick flash of anger you feel when someone cuts you off in traffic, but something deeper and more volcanic. This was betrayal in its purest form, wrapped up in the language of love and concern. I heard footsteps upstairs, the familiar sounds of my children moving around in the bedrooms they'd grown up in. Michael had been living in the basement since his divorce 8 months ago, supposedly just until he got back on his feet. Jessica lived across town but had been showing up more frequently lately, always with some concern about my finances or my dating life. Sarah, my youngest, had been practically glued to my side since she graduated college last year, working part-time jobs while pursuing her photography dream with my financial support. None of them had moved out properly. None of them had established true independence. And now I understood why. They weren't staying close because they loved spending time with their mother. They were protecting their investment. The kitchen felt different that morning, charged with attention I'd been too blind to see building. The family photos on the refrigerator seemed to mock me now. Birthday parties, graduations, family vacations paid for with my overtime hours, and careful budgeting. Had they been planning this? How long had they been discussing their mother like she was a problem to be solved? I tested the tape around my wrists. It was tight, professionally applied. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision. They had planned this carefully, probably researching the best way to restrain someone without causing injury. The thought made my stomach turn. Robert. Sweet Robert would be expecting his good morning text any minute now. We'd been dating for 8 months, and he'd become part of my daily routine in the most wonderful way. He was a retired high school principal, widowed like me, with grown children who lived their own lives and wanted their father to be happy. What a concept. When I told my children about Robert, their reactions should have been my first warning. Jessica had immediately asked about his financial situation. Michael had run a background check without asking me. Sarah had started crying and asking if I was trying to replace their father. Not one of them had asked if he made me happy. I heard Jessica's voice first, calling down from upstairs. "Mom, are you awake? We're coming down in a few minutes to talk." Talk, as if conversation was possible when one party was tied to a chair. "I'm awake," I called back, my voice steadier than I felt. "And I'd like to know why I can't move my arms." Silence. Then whispered conversation I couldn't quite make out. I imagined them up there, probably having second thoughts now that the reality of what they'd done was setting in. But not enough second thoughts to come downstairs and cut me loose. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the quiet house. 8:15. I was supposed to be at work by 9, but somehow I didn't think my children cared about my professional responsibilities. This was bigger than missing a day of work. This was about control, power, and money. Always money. I thought about the last 5 years since David died, how my children had gradually inserted themselves into every aspect of my life under the guise of helping their grieving mother. Jessica becoming a co-signer on my checking account, just in case something happened. Michael moving back home during his divorce, and somehow never leaving. Sarah constantly needing financial support for her artistic pursuits, while showing no real progress toward independence. I'd enabled it all because I was lonely, and because having my children need me felt better than the empty house I'd been facing. But need and love aren't the same thing, and I was finally understanding the difference. The footsteps upstairs grew more purposeful. They were coming down, probably having finished their final strategy session about how to handle their captive mother. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I straightened my spine as much as the restraints allowed and prepared to meet my children as the woman who raised them, not the victim they'd tried to create. Jessica appeared first, dressed in her business clothes like she was heading to her job at the insurance company after this little family meeting. Her blonde hair was pulled back in the severe bun she'd started wearing since her promotion to management, and she had that particular expression she'd perfected as a teenager when she thought she knew better than everyone else. "Good morning, Mom," she said, as if finding me tied to a chair was the most natural thing in the world. "I hope you slept well." "I slept fine until I woke up imprisoned in my own kitchen," I replied, looking directly into her blue eyes, the same blue eyes I'd looked into when she was a colicky baby who wouldn't sleep through the night. Michael appeared next, my middle child who'd inherited his father's height and his grandfather's stubborn streak. At 25, he still had the ability to look like a guilty little boy when caught doing something wrong. But this morning, he was trying to project authority he hadn't earned. "Mom, we need to have a serious conversation about your recent decisions," he said, crossing his arms over his chest. "And we needed to make sure you'd actually listen instead of just dismissing our concerns like you usually do." Sarah, my baby, stood in the doorway, looking less confident than her siblings. At 23, she still had that soft vulnerability that had made her the easiest to spoil and the hardest to discipline. But she was here, complicit in this, which somehow hurt the most. "We're doing this because we love you," she said quietly, tears already forming in her green eyes. "We can't just stand by and watch you make a huge mistake." I looked at these three adults, my children, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. The unconditional maternal love that had defined my existence for nearly 3 decades didn't disappear, but it was joined by something else: disappointment. Deep, bone-deep disappointment in the people they'd chosen to become. "So let me understand this correctly," I said, my voice calm despite the storm raging inside me. "The three of you decided that the appropriate response to your mother falling in love was to tie her up in her own kitchen like a kidnapping victim." "It's not kidnapping," Jessica said quickly. "You're in your own home, and we're not asking for ransom. We just need you to understand what's at stake here." "What's at stake?" I repeated slowly. "You mean your inheritance." The word hung in the air like a curse. None of them denied it. Michael shifted uncomfortably. Sarah looked at the floor. Jessica lifted her chin defiantly. "This house, Dad's life insurance, your retirement savings, the investment account," Jessica said. "Do you have any idea what you're risking by rushing into marriage with someone you barely know?" "I've known Robert for 8 months," I said. "I knew your father for 6 months before we got married." "That was different," Michael interjected. "You were young then. You didn't have assets to protect." Assets to protect. They were talking about my life, my happiness, my future as if they were financial advisors discussing a portfolio. As if I were incompetent to manage my own affairs at 58 years old. "And what exactly do you think Robert is after?" I asked. "My vast fortune? My luxury lifestyle? The glamorous life of a small-town accountant?" "Mom, don't be naive," Jessica said, her voice taking on that condescending tone she'd developed in her 20s. "Older men target women like you all the time. Lonely widows with property and savings accounts. Women like me. Lonely widows." The clinical way she described my life, as if my grief and subsequent healing were just predictable patterns that made me vulnerable to predators. That's when I heard it. A car door slamming in my driveway. Then another. My children heard it too, and I watched their confident expressions shift to confusion. The doorbell rang once, sharp and authoritative. Then again. I smiled for the first time since waking up. That would be my lawyer. The blood drained from Jessica's face. "Your what?" "My attorney, Patricia Williams from Williams Associates downtown. I asked her to stop by this morning at 8:30 if she didn't hear from me by 8. The doorbell rang a third time, followed by a firm knock and a woman's voice calling out, "Mrs. Morrison, this is Patricia Williams. We had an appointment." "This morning?" Sarah started crying harder. Michael ran his hands through his hair. Jessica's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "You see, children," I said, feeling a strange calm settling over me. "When you're a 58-year-old woman planning to remarry, you make sure all your legal affairs are in order first. And when you have adult children who seem more concerned about your assets than your happiness, you take certain precautions." The knocking grew more insistent. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm using the spare key you gave me. This constitutes an emergency situation." I heard the front door open and Patricia's heels clicking across my hardwood floors. Within seconds, she appeared in the kitchen doorway, took in the scene of me tied to a chair with my 3 adult children, standing around looking guilty, and pulled out her phone. "Well," she said in her crisp, professional voice, "this is either the most unusual family meeting I've ever witnessed, or I need to call the police immediately." Patricia Williams was exactly the kind of lawyer I'd hoped to find when I started looking for legal advice 3 weeks ago. In her mid-40s, sharply dressed, and completely unimpressed by emotional manipulation. She'd listened to my concerns about my children's increasing control over my life and helped me develop a plan. "Please don't call the police," Sarah sobbed. "We were just trying to protect her." "From what?" Patricia asked coolly, walking over to examine my restraints. "Making her own decisions as a competent adult?" She calmly opened my kitchen drawer, retrieved a pair of scissors, and cut through the duct tape binding my wrists. As the circulation returned to my hands, I felt something else return too. My power, my autonomy, my sense of self-worth that had been slowly eroding under months of my children's financial anxiety disguised as concern. I stood up slowly, rubbing my wrists where the tape had left red marks. The physical evidence of my children's betrayal would fade, but the emotional evidence would last much longer. "Kids," I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd somehow lost track of over the past few years. "Sit down." For the first time in months, they actually obeyed me without argument. Maybe it was Patricia's presence. Maybe it was the tone in my voice they hadn't heard since they were teenagers testing boundaries. They took seats around the kitchen table, where we'd shared so many family meals, but this wasn't going to be a heartwarming family moment. I walked to my purse and retrieved a manila folder Patricia had prepared for me the week before. Inside were copies of legal documents that would change everything. "You want to know about your inheritance?" I asked, looking at each of them in turn. "Let me tell you exactly what your inheritance looks like now." I opened the folder slowly, deliberately, watching my children's faces as they realized this wasn't just an empty threat. These were real legal documents with official letterheads and notary stamps. Patricia stood beside me like a silent guardian, her presence lending weight to every word I was about to speak. "Jessica," I said, looking directly at my oldest daughter, "you are no longer a co-signer on any of my bank accounts. That change was made official last Friday." Her face went from pale to ashen. "But Mom, what if there's an emergency? What if something happens to you?" "Then Patricia here has been designated as my financial power of attorney," I replied calmly. "Someone who sees me as a client to protect, not an asset to manage." I pulled out the next document. "Michael, you have exactly 30 days to find your own apartment. After November 15th, you'll be considered a trespassing tenant, and I will pursue legal eviction proceedings." My son's mouth fell open. "You can't be serious. I'm your son. I'm going through a difficult time." "You've been going through a difficult time for 8 months, I said, "and I've supported you through every day of it. But that support was never meant to be permanent, and it certainly doesn't give you the right to hold me prisoner in my own home." Sarah was crying openly now, but I couldn't let her tears derail me this time. They'd been her most effective weapon since childhood, and I'd fallen for them too many times. "Sarah, sweetie," I said, my voice gentler but no less firm, "your photography equipment loans are now considered gifts. I don't expect repayment, but I also won't be providing any additional funding for your business ventures." "But Mom, I'm so close to getting my studio off the ground," she sobbed. "Just a few more months and I'll be profitable." "You've been a few months away from profitability for over a year," I said. "And during that time, you've borrowed $12,000 from me while working part-time jobs that barely cover your car payment." Patricia stepped forward, her briefcase clicking open with professional precision. "Mrs. Morrison has also restructured her entire estate plan," she announced. "The house will be placed in a trust upon her death, with specific instructions for its sale and distribution." The silence in the kitchen was deafening. I could hear the grandfather clock in the living room ticking away the seconds, each one seeming to echo in the space between my children's shocked faces and my newfound resolve. "What does that mean exactly?" Jessica asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It means," I said, sitting down at the head of the kitchen table for the first time in years, claiming the position of authority I'd somehow abdicated, "that this house will be sold after my death, with the proceeds split between the Children's Hospital of Wisconsin, the American Cancer Society, and a small educational trust fund for any grandchildren I may have someday. Michael's face was turning red, the way it used to when he was a toddler having a tantrum. "You're giving our inheritance to charity?" "I'm giving my money to causes I believe in," I corrected. "Money that I earned through 35 years of working, saving, and sacrificing. Money that was never yours to begin with." "But Dad always said the house would go to us kids," Sarah said between sobs. "Your father said a lot of things when you were children," I replied. "But he also said he wanted me to be happy after he was gone. He made me promise to keep living, to find joy again. I don't think tying me to a chair was what he had in mind when he made me make that promise." I pulled out another document, this one thicker than the others. "However, you each will receive $10,000 from my life insurance policy, which is $10,000 more than children who physically restrain their mother deserve. But I'm hoping it will help you understand that this isn't about punishment. It's about boundaries." $10,000? Jessica's voice cracked. "Mom, do you realize how much this house is worth? How much Dad's life insurance was? We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars that you're just throwing away." "I'm not throwing anything away," I said. "I'm investing it in my own life while I'm still alive to enjoy it. And when I'm gone, I'm making sure it goes to people who will use it to help others, not people who see it as an entitlement." The kitchen felt smaller somehow, as if the weight of this conversation was pressing down on all of us. These were my children, the babies I'd nursed through illnesses, the toddlers I'd chased around this very room, the teenagers I'd waited up for on Friday nights. Now they were adults who had tied me to a chair to protect money that existed only in their imaginations. Patricia consulted her notes. "There's also the matter of the cease and desist order regarding any future interference with Mrs. Morrison's personal relationships or financial decisions." "What does that mean?" Michael asked. "It means," Patricia explained in her crisp legal tone, "that any attempt to manipulate, coerce, or physically restrain Mrs. Morrison will result in immediate legal action. This includes, but is not limited to, hiding her car keys, taking her phone, restricting her movement, or attempting to contact her romantic partners with false information." I watched my children's faces as they processed this. They were learning, perhaps for the first time, that their mother was a separate person with legal rights that superseded their comfort level with her choices. "And if any of you contest the will or attempt to claim undue influence regarding my relationship with Robert," I continued, "your $10,000 inheritance becomes $0. Patricia has documentation of this morning's events, including photographs of the restraints you used on me." Sarah looked up sharply. "You took pictures?" Patricia held up her phone. "Standard documentation for potential domestic abuse cases," she said matter-of-factly. "Physical restraint of a competent adult by family members falls under several legal categories, none of them favorable to the perpetrators." The word perpetrators hung in the air like a slap. My children, who probably still thought of themselves as concerned family members staging an intervention, were suddenly faced with the legal reality of what they'd done. "This is insane," Jessica said, standing up abruptly. "We're your children. We love you. We're trying to protect you from making a mistake that could ruin your life." "No," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in months. "You're trying to protect yourselves from losing money you were never guaranteed. There's a difference." I thought about all the conversations we'd had over the past 8 months since I'd started dating Robert. Not once had any of them asked if he made me laugh. Not once had they inquired about whether he treated me with respect or kindness. Every concern had been financial. Every question had been about his intentions regarding my assets. "Do you know what Robert did last weekend?" I asked them. "He spent 6 hours helping Mrs. Patterson next door clean out her gutters because her son lives in California and can't help her. He didn't ask for payment. He didn't expect anything in return. He did it because it needed doing, and he was capable of doing it. Michael snorted. That doesn't prove anything except that he's good at playing the part. The part of what? A decent human being? Is that really so hard to believe that someone might care about me for reasons that have nothing to do with my bank account? The hurt in my voice surprised even me. I hadn't realized how deeply their suspicions had cut, until I heard myself defending a man who had never given them any reason to doubt his character, beyond the simple fact that he loved their mother. "Mom?" Sarah said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "We just don't want you to get hurt. When Dad died, you were so broken. We watched you cry yourself to sleep for months. We can't bear the thought of someone taking advantage of that." For a moment, her words almost broke through my resolve. The grief she was referencing was real. The protective instincts she was claiming were touching. But then I remembered the duct tape around my wrists and the cold calculation it had taken to plan this morning's ambush. "Sweetheart," I said, reaching across the table to touch her hand. "I appreciate that you don't want me to be hurt. But protecting someone doesn't mean controlling them. And it certainly doesn't mean tying them up when they make choices you don't agree with." I pulled my hand back and looked at all three of them again. "Besides, you weren't protecting me from getting hurt. You were protecting yourselves from potentially inheriting less money. If you were worried about my emotional well-being, you would have invited Robert over for dinner. You would have gotten to know him. You would have asked me how he makes me feel instead of asking me how much money he has." The truth of this statement settled over the kitchen like a heavy blanket. None of them could deny it, because none of them had ever tried to get to know Robert as a person. He'd been a threat to their financial futures from the moment I'd mentioned his name. Patricia cleared her throat. "Mrs. Morrison, we should also discuss the timeline for these changes." "Of course," I said, grateful for her professional presence, keeping this conversation on track. "The banking changes are already in effect. Michael's 30-day notice begins today. The new will and trust documents are already filed and witnessed." "What about the wedding?" Jessica asked, her voice hollow. I smiled for what felt like the first time in months. "The wedding is scheduled for December 15th at the courthouse downtown. Robert and I will be honeymooning in Florida for 2 weeks over Christmas." The finality of this announcement seemed to hit them all at once. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't a discussion where their input would be considered and potentially change my mind. This was me informing them of decisions I'd already made. "But what about Christmas?" Sarah asked. "We always spend Christmas here. It's tradition." "Traditions can change," I said gently. "You're all adults now with your own lives. Maybe it's time to start some new traditions." The kitchen that had been the heart of our family life for so many years suddenly felt like a courtroom where a verdict was being delivered. But unlike a criminal trial, there was no innocent party here. We had all played our parts in reaching this point. I thought about the last 5 Christmases since David died, how I'd thrown myself into maintaining every tradition, cooking every favorite dish, buying every gift, trying to keep our family intact through sheer force of will and holiday spirit. My children had participated, but more and more it had felt like they were humoring their grieving mother rather than genuinely wanting to be there. This year would be different. This year I would wake up Christmas morning in a hotel room in St. Petersburg with a man who loved me for who I was right now, not for who I used to be or what I could provide. "I think," Patricia said, checking her watch. "We've covered all the immediate legal matters. Mrs. Morrison, you'll want to call your bank and your employer to report this morning's incident." "Report it?" Michael asked. "You're going to report us?" "I'm going to document what happened," I said, "for my own protection and for yours. This way there's an official record that we've addressed this issue and established clear boundaries moving forward." The implications of this were sinking. And their mother, the woman who had spent decades protecting them from consequences, was now ensuring that their actions had consequences. "I can't believe you're doing this to us," Jessica said, tears finally breaking through her composed facade. "We're your children. We love you more than anyone else in the world ever could." "If this is how you love me," I said quietly, "then I need to find a different kind of love." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Patricia closing her briefcase and the grandfather clock chiming 9 o'clock in the living room. I was officially late for work, but somehow that seemed like the least important thing in the world right now. "I need to call my office," I said, standing up from the table. "And then I need to call Robert and tell him why I didn't answer his good morning text." "What are you going to tell him?" Sarah asked. "The truth," I said, "that my children were concerned about our relationship and chose to express that concern by holding me hostage in my own kitchen." The stark honesty of this statement seemed to hit them harder than any anger or accusations could have. They were going to have to live with the reality of what they'd done, and more importantly, they were going to have to explain it to other people. Patricia handed me her business card. "Call me if there are any further incidents," she said. "And congratulations on your upcoming wedding." As she left, the kitchen fell silent again. My 3 children sat around the table looking lost and confused, as if they couldn't quite understand how their intervention had backfired so completely. I looked at them one more time. These adults I'd raised, these people I'd sacrificed so much for, and felt something shift permanently in my chest. The unconditional love was still there, but it was no longer unconditional tolerance. They were going to have to earn their way back into my life through respect, not manipulation. "I'm going upstairs to shower and get ready for work," I said. "When I come back down, I expect you all to be gone. We can talk again when you're ready to treat me like the adult I am instead of the problem you think I've become." As I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, I could hear them talking in urgent whispers behind me. Planning their next move, probably. Trying to figure out how to undo what they'd done or find a way around the legal barriers I'd erected. But for the first time in months, I wasn't worried about managing their emotions or preventing their disappointment. I was focused on my own life, my own happiness, my own future. And that future included a man who had never once asked me about my financial situation, but had spent an hour last week helping me plant tulip bulbs in the front yard because he knew they were my favorite flowers. The hot water of the shower felt like baptism, washing away the morning's trauma and the months of accumulated resentment. When I stepped out and looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. I saw a woman who had chosen herself over other people's expectations. I saw Linda Morrison, not just somebody's mother or somebody's widow, but a complete person with her own dreams and desires and the legal right to pursue them. And for the first time since David died, that woman was smiling back at me. When I came back downstairs 45 minutes later, dressed in my navy blue work suit and carrying my briefcase, the kitchen was empty. The only evidence of the morning's drama was the strips of duct tape on the counter, where Patricia had cut them from my wrists, and the lingering smell of my children's desperation hanging in the air like smoke after a fire. My phone had been buzzing constantly while I was getting ready. 7 missed calls from Jessica, 4 from Michael, and a string of increasingly frantic text messages from Sarah. I didn't read them. Instead, I opened my contacts and found Robert's number, my finger hovering over his name while I tried to figure out how to explain that my morning had started with my own children committing what was technically a felony. The phone rang twice before his warm, familiar voice answered. "Good morning, beautiful. I was starting to worry when I didn't hear from you." Just hearing him say my name in that gentle tone that held no agenda, no hidden calculations, made my throat tighten with emotion. "Robert, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen to the whole story before you react." "Okay," he said immediately, and I could hear the concern creeping into his voice. "Are you all right? You sound shaken." "I'm all right now," I said, sitting down at the kitchen table where this whole nightmare had unfolded. "But this morning, I woke up tied to a chair in my own kitchen." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "Linda," he finally said, his voice carefully controlled. "Did someone break into your house? Have you called?" "The police?" "No break-in," I said. "It was my children. Jessica, Michael, and Sarah. They decided to stage what they called an intervention to prevent me from marrying you." Another long pause. Then, "They tied you up with duct tape. They left me a note explaining that they weren't going to let me destroy their inheritance by marrying a gold digger." The words tasted bitter coming out of my mouth, but I needed him to understand exactly what kind of people my children had revealed themselves to be. "Jesus Christ, Linda." His voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "Are you hurt? Did they harm you physically?" "Just some red marks on my wrists where the tape was too tight. Nothing that won't heal." I touched the tender spots gingerly, evidence of my children's cruelty that would fade faster than the emotional wounds they'd inflicted. "I'm coming over," he said immediately. "I'm leaving work right now." "You don't have to do that. I'm actually about to head into the office myself. I need normalcy today. I need to remember who I am outside of this family drama." Robert worked as a volunteer coordinator at the local Veterans Center, helping former military personnel transition back into civilian life. He understood trauma, understood the need to feel useful and productive when your world had been shaken. "What did you do?" he asked, "when you woke up and realized what they'd done?" "I called my lawyer," I said, and I couldn't keep a note of satisfaction out of my voice. "Patricia Williams. She came over this morning and helped me explain some legal realities to my children." "You already had a lawyer involved?" There was something like pride in his voice now, mixed with the concern. "I've been working with her for 3 weeks, ever since I realized that my children saw our relationship as a threat to their financial future, rather than a source of their mother's happiness. I've restructured my entire estate, Robert. They're not getting what they thought they were getting." The words felt powerful coming out of my mouth. For so many years, I'd been the one apologizing, explaining, justifying my choices to my children. Now they were the ones who would have to live with the consequences of their actions. "How are you feeling right now?" Robert asked, and I loved him a little more for that question. Not what was I going to do, not how this would affect our relationship, but how was I feeling in this moment? "Angry," I said honestly, "hurt, disappointed, but also relieved? Like I finally understand who they really are instead of who I kept hoping they would become." "And us?" he asked quietly. "How does this affect us?" I closed my eyes and pictured his face, the way his brown eyes crinkled when he smiled, the careful way he'd courted me like I was something precious instead of something convenient. At 62, Robert had learned patience from his first marriage, had learned to value kindness over passion, compatibility over chemistry. "It doesn't change anything about us," I said firmly. "If anything, it makes me more certain that you're exactly what I need in my life. You've never once asked me about money, Robert. You've never calculated what being with me might be worth financially. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Linda, I have my own pension, my own savings, my own house. I don't need your money. I need your laugh when we're watching old movies. I need the way you hum while you're cooking. I need how you remember everyone's birthdays and send handwritten cards. That's what I fell in love with." Tears started flowing then, the kind that come from relief rather than pain. My children had spent 8 months trying to convince me that Robert's interest in me had to be financial, because what else could a man possibly want from a 58-year-old widow? But Robert had just listed the things about me that had nothing to do with my bank account and everything to do with who I was as a person. "I love you too," I said through my tears. "And I'm going to marry you in December exactly like we planned, whether my children attend or not." "Are you sure you don't want me to come over?" he asked. I could pick up lunch from that little deli you like, and we could talk this through." "I'm sure," I said, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand. "I need to go to work and act like a normal person for a few hours. But Robert? Thank you for not making this about you. Thank you for not wondering if this changes anything between us. Thank you for just caring about how I'm feeling. That's what love is supposed to look like, sweetheart. I'll call you tonight when you're home from work, and we can talk more. Then." After we hung up, I sat in the quiet kitchen for a few more minutes, processing the contrast between that conversation and the one I'd had with my children an hour earlier. Robert's first concern had been my physical and emotional well-being. My children's first concern had been their financial security. The drive to work felt surreal, like I was moving through a world that looked the same, but operated under completely different rules than it had yesterday. The trees were still shedding their autumn leaves, the traffic lights still controlled the flow of cars, but I was a different person behind the wheel. I was someone who had legal documents protecting her from her own children. I was someone who had chosen love over family approval. Henderson Associates sat in a converted Victorian house downtown, with my office on the second floor overlooking Main Street. I'd always loved the view from my window, the way I could watch the small dramas of daily life play out below, while I worked with numbers that told their own stories about people's dreams and struggles. My assistant, Maria, looked up when I walked, in an hour later than usual. "Linda, you look like you've seen a ghost. Everything okay?" Maria was 26, fresh out of college, with an earnestness about her work that reminded me why I'd loved accounting in the first place. Numbers didn't lie. They didn't manipulate. They didn't tie you to chairs when they didn't like your personal decisions. "Family drama," I said, which was both completely accurate and utterly inadequate to describe the morning's events. Nothing that won't sort itself out eventually. I spent the morning immersed in quarterly reports for a local restaurant chain, finding comfort in the predictable patterns of income and expenses, profit and loss. There was something soothing about problems that could be solved with careful analysis and proper documentation. Around noon, my desk phone rang. The caller ID showed my home number, which meant one of my children was calling from my own house phone. I let it go to voicemail. 5 minutes later, it rang again. Then again. On the fourth call, I picked up. "Henderson and Associates, Linda Morrison speaking." "Mom, it's Jessica. We need to talk." Her voice was different now, missing the authoritative tone she'd used this morning. She sounded younger, more uncertain. "I'm at work, Jessica. This isn't an appropriate time for personal calls. Mom, please." "We're still at the house, and we've been talking, and we think maybe we overreacted this morning." Overreacted. As if tying someone to a chair was just a slightly excessive response to ordinary family disagreement. "Jessica, I told you to be gone when I came downstairs from my shower. The fact that you're calling me from my own house phone suggests you didn't listen to that instruction. We couldn't just leave things like this. We're family. We need to work this out." I leaned back in my desk chair and looked out at the street below, where normal people were going about their normal lives without having to worry about their adult children staging kidnapping interventions. "We are family," I agreed, which is exactly why what you did this morning is so unforgivable. Family members don't restrain each other. They don't hold each other prisoner. They don't treat each other like problems to be solved. "We were scared," Jessica said, and now she was crying. "We were scared of losing you to someone who might not have your best interests at heart." "No," I said firmly. "You were scared of losing access to money you've never earned. There's a difference, and until you can acknowledge that difference, we don't have anything to discuss." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. Finally, she spoke again, her voice small and defeated. "What do you want from us, Mom? What do we have to do to fix this?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself all morning. What would it take for my children to earn their way back into my life? What would constitute genuine change versus manipulation designed to get them back into my good graces and my will? I want you to get to know Robert, I said finally. Not to interrogate him about his finances or investigate his background or treat him like a threat. I want you to invite him to dinner and ask him about his grandchildren and his volunteer, work and his garden. I want you to see him as a person I love instead of a problem you need to solve. Okay, Jessica said quickly. We can do that. We can have him over for dinner this weekend. Not we, Jessica. You. Each of you, individually. You're all adults with your own homes and your own lives, or at least you should be. I want each of you to make an effort to build a relationship with the man I'm going to marry. The concept seemed to confuse her. For years, my children had operated as a unit when it came to family decisions, especially decisions about me. They'd formed a coalition against my autonomy, without even realizing they were doing it. And I want genuine apologies, I continued. Not, I'm sorry you were upset, or I'm sorry we overreacted. I want acknowledgement of exactly what you did wrong and why it was wrong. Mom, we said we were sorry this morning. No, you said you were trying to protect me. That's not the same thing as being sorry. Being sorry requires understanding that what you did was harmful and inexcusable, regardless of your intentions. Through my office window, I watched a young mother pushing a stroller down the sidewalk, probably heading to the park 3 blocks away. Her toddler was walking beside her, occasionally running ahead before circling back to grab her hand. That's what healthy family relationships looked like. Independence balanced with connection. Trust balanced with boundaries. I have to get back to work, Jessica, but I want you and your brother and sister out of my house by the time I get home tonight. If you want to rebuild our relationship, you can start by respecting my space and my boundaries. What about Michael? Where is he supposed to go? He doesn't have anywhere else to live. Michael is 25 years old with a college degree and a job. He'll figure it out the same way millions of other adults figure it out every day. The basement bedroom is no longer available to him. I could hear muffled conversation in the background, probably Jessica covering the phone while she consulted with her siblings about this latest development. Mom, she said when she came back on the line, we love you. We know we messed up this morning, but we love you, and we don't want to lose you. Then start treating me like someone you love instead of someone you own, I said. Love doesn't tie people to chairs, Jessica. Love doesn't hold people hostage to protect financial interests. Love wants the other person to be happy, even when that happiness doesn't align with your personal preferences. After I hung up, I sat staring at my computer screen for a long time, trying to focus on the spreadsheet in front of me, but finding my mind wandering to the larger implications of the morning's events. This wasn't just about my children's behavior. This was about the person I'd become over the past 5 years. The way I'd gradually surrendered my autonomy in exchange for their continued presence in my life. When David died, I'd been so terrified of being alone that I'd welcomed their increased involvement in my affairs. Jessica helping with the insurance paperwork had felt like support, not control. Michael moving back home had felt like comfort, not manipulation. Sarah's constant need for financial assistance had felt like bonding, not exploitation. But somewhere along the way, their help had become supervision. Their concern had become control. Their presence had become possession. My phone buzzed with a text message from Robert. Thinking about you. Hope your day is getting better. Looking forward to talking tonight. I smiled despite everything. Here was a man who was thinking about my emotional well-being in the middle of his own busy day. A man who understood that love meant wanting someone to be happy, not wanting to control the source of their happiness. The afternoon passed slowly, but it was a productive kind of slow. I finished the restaurant chain reports, reviewed the quarterly, projections for 2 of our nonprofit clients, and returned phone calls that had been piling up all week. Normal work, normal problems, normal solutions. Around 4 o'clock, Maria knocked on my office door. "Linda, there's a delivery for you downstairs." I wasn't expecting anything, but I followed her down to the reception area where a young man, in a uniform, was holding a beautiful arrangement of autumn flowers, chrysanthemums, asters, and oak leaves arranged in a rustic wooden box. The card read, "For a strong woman having a difficult day. You deserve beauty in your life every single day. Love, Robert." I carried the arrangement back to my office and set it on my desk where I could see it while I worked. The flowers weren't expensive or elaborate, but they were thoughtful. They were chosen by someone who knew I was struggling and wanted to remind me that I was cherished. My children had never sent me flowers. In 28 years of being their mother, through birthdays and Mother's Days and holidays, they'd never once thought to surprise me with something beautiful just because they loved me. They bought me practical gifts, useful things, items that served a purpose, but never beauty for its own sake. The contrast was stark and painful. Robert had known me for 8 months and understood that I needed beauty in my life. My children had known me for decades and saw me primarily as a source of practical support. My phone rang again around 5 o'clock, just as I was preparing to leave for the day. This time it was Sarah calling from her own cell phone instead of my house. "Mom, I wanted to call and tell you that we've moved Michael's stuff out of the basement. He's going to stay with his friend Dave for a while until he finds his own place." "Thank you," I said, surprised by how much relief I felt at this news. That was the right thing to do. "Mom, I also wanted to say that I'm sorry. Really sorry. Not sorry that you're upset, but sorry that we thought it was okay to tie you up. That was wrong, and it was scary, and I feel sick thinking about how scared you must have been." This was the first genuine apology I'd heard all day, and it caught me off guard. Sarah had always been the most emotionally intelligent of my children, the one most capable of seeing situations from other people's perspectives. "Thank you, sweetheart. That means a lot to me." "Can I ask you something?" she said, her voice hesitant. "Are you really going to cut us out of your will completely?" "I'm going to make sure that my money goes to people and causes that will use it to help others," I said carefully. "That includes some money for your future children's education, but it doesn't include large inheritance payments for adults who see me as a bank account rather than a person. What if we change? What if we prove to you that we can treat you better?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been wrestling with all day. Were people capable of fundamental change, or would my children simply get better at hiding their true motivations? "I don't know, Sarah. I hope you can change. I hope all 3 of you can learn to see me as a whole person with my own needs and desires. But trust, once broken, takes a very long time to rebuild. Will you at least give us a chance to try?" I looked at the flowers on my desk, at the card that reminded me what healthy love looked like. "I'll give you a chance," I said finally. "But it has to be real change, not performance change. And it has to start with respecting my relationship with Robert instead of trying to sabotage it." "I'd like to meet him properly," Sarah said. "Not to interrogate him or investigate him, but to get to know the person who makes my mom happy." "I'd like that too," I said, and meant it. "But Sarah, you have to understand that your approval or disapproval of Robert isn't going to change my decision to marry him. I'm not asking for your permission. I'm offering you the opportunity to be part of my happiness instead of standing in opposition to it." "I understand," she said quietly. "And Mom, I really am sorry. What we did this morning was wrong, and I promise it will never happen again." After we hung up, I packed up my briefcase and prepared to head home. The day that had started with me waking up restrained in my own kitchen was ending with flowers on my desk and the first genuine apology from one of my children. It wasn't forgiveness yet. It wasn't trust rebuilt. But it was a start, and maybe that was enough for today. The drive home took me past the park where Robert and I had had our first official date 8 months ago. We'd walked the trails around, the pond, talking about our late spouses, our children, our hopes for whatever time we had left in this world. I remembered being nervous that day, worried that I was too old to be starting over, too set in my ways to open my heart again. Robert had been patient with my fears, understanding about my grief, gentle with my tentative steps back into the world of romantic love. He'd never pushed, never demanded, never made me feel like I owed him anything more than honesty about my feelings. My children could learn something from his example about how to love someone without trying to own them. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed that Michael's car was gone and the basement lights were off. True to their word, my children had removed themselves from my space. It was a small gesture, but it was something. The house felt different when I walked in. Quieter, but not empty. Peaceful rather than tense. I set my briefcase down, arranged Robert's flowers on the kitchen table, and poured myself a glass of wine. For the first time in months, I was alone in my own home without feeling lonely. I was alone by choice, surrounded by my own things, accountable to no one but myself. It felt like freedom. 3 weeks later, I stood in my kitchen making coffee on a Saturday morning when the doorbell rang. Through the front window, I could see Sarah on my porch, holding what looked like a small wrapped gift and shifting nervously from foot to foot. She'd called the night before asking if she could stop by, and for the first time in months, I'd said yes without feeling like I was setting myself up for manipulation. The changes in our family dynamic hadn't happened overnight. Jessica was still struggling to accept that her role as the family financial manager had been permanently revoked. She'd called twice more in the past few weeks, each time with a different argument about why my estate planning decisions were mistakes I'd regret. Each time, I'd calmly explained that my decisions were final and suggested she focus on building her own financial security instead of counting on mine. Michael had found an apartment near his job at the insurance company and seemed to be adjusting to actual independence better than any of us had expected. He'd even thanked me last weekend for forcing him to move out, admitting that living in my basement had been holding him back from growing up. That conversation had given me hope that maybe, eventually, we could rebuild something resembling a healthy mother-son relationship. But Sarah had been different. Over the past 3 weeks, she'd made genuine efforts to change how she approached our relationship. She'd gotten a full-time job at a local photography studio, stopped asking me for money, and most importantly, she'd asked to meet Robert properly. I opened the door to find my youngest daughter looking more mature than I'd seen her in years. She was dressed professionally, her hair pulled back neatly, and there was something in her posture that suggested she was taking this visit seriously. "Good morning, Mom," she said, holding up the wrapped package. "I brought you something, but it's not what you think." I invited her in and led her to the living room, the same room where family meetings used to devolve into arguments about my dating life and financial decisions. Today, it felt different. Lighter somehow. "It's not a bribe or an apology gift," Sarah continued, settling into the armchair across from me. "It's something I made for you because I wanted to, not because I needed something from you." I unwrapped the gift carefully, finding a beautiful framed photograph inside. It was a picture she'd taken of me and Robert at the farmer's market 2 weeks ago, though I hadn't realized she was there that day. We were looking at each other and laughing about something, and the joy on both our faces was unmistakable. "Sarah, this is beautiful," I said, genuinely touched. "When did you take this?" "I was there buying vegetables for my apartment, and I saw you two together. At first, I was going to avoid you because I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me. But then I watched you with him for a few minutes, and Mom, I've never seen you look that happy. Not even when Dad was alive." The honesty in her voice caught me off guard. My children had always idealized their father's memory, holding it up, as the gold standard against which any future relationship would be measured. To hear Sarah acknowledge that Robert brought me a different kind of joy was both painful and healing. "Robert makes me feel like myself again," I said, running my finger along the edge of the frame. "Not like somebody's widow or somebody's mother, just like Linda. It's been a long time since I felt like just Linda was enough for someone." Sarah nodded, tears forming in her green eyes. "I think that's what I've been most afraid of, actually. Not that Robert would take advantage of you, but that you'd become someone different, someone who didn't need us anymore." This was the conversation I'd been hoping to have with my children for months. Not about money or inheritance or financial security, but about the deeper fears that had driven their controlling behavior. "Sweetheart," I said, leaning forward to take her hand. "Growing into my own person again doesn't mean I stop being your mother. It just means I stop making your emotional comfort more important than my own well-being." "I know that now," she said, "or at least I'm learning it. The thing is, when Dad died, we all kind of made you our project. Taking care of Mom became our family identity. And when you started getting better, started wanting things for yourself again, it felt like we were losing our purpose." The insight was both mature and heartbreaking. I thought about the past 5 years, how my children had rallied around me during my grief, how their concern had gradually shifted from supporting my healing to managing my choices. They'd gotten comfortable being needed, and my recovery had threatened that comfort. "You know what your purpose should be?" I asked. "Living your own lives so fully and joyfully that when you visit me, you have interesting stories to tell and exciting plans to share. I want to be proud of who you're becoming, not just grateful that you're taking care of me." Sarah wiped her eyes and smiled. "I actually do have some exciting news. The photography studio offered me a promotion. I'd be managing their wedding photography department, and it comes with a significant salary increase." "Sarah, that's wonderful." I felt genuine pride swelling in my chest, the kind of motherly joy that had been buried under years of worry about her financial dependence. "Tell me everything." For the next 20 minutes, we talked about her career plans, her new apartment, her ideas for building her own photography business on the side. She was animated and passionate, more like the ambitious young woman I remembered from her college graduation than the directionless adult who'd been borrowing money for vague artistic projects. "There's something else," she said as our conversation wound down. "I'd like to invite you and Robert over for dinner next weekend. Nothing fancy, just the 3 of us. I want to cook for you the way you've cooked for me all these years." The offer was simple, but it represented everything I'd been hoping for. My daughter wanted to get to know the man I loved, not to judge or evaluate him, but to understand what made me happy. She wanted to give back instead of just taking. She wanted to be a host instead of always being a guest. "I'd love that," I said. "And Sarah, I know Robert would be honored. He's been hoping to get to know you better." "Really?" She looked surprised. "I kind of assumed he saw us as obstacles to overcome." "Robert sees you as my children, which makes you important to him by default. He knows how much I love you, even when you frustrate me beyond belief. He wants our relationship to work out because he wants me to be happy." After Sarah left, I called Robert to tell him about the dinner invitation. His enthusiasm was immediate and genuine, which didn't surprise me but still warmed my heart. Here was a man who understood that loving me meant accepting all the complicated relationships that came with me, including the ones that had caused me pain. "Should I bring anything?" he asked. "Wine? Flowers? What's the protocol for dinner? With your almost stepdaughter who used to think I was a gold digger?" I laughed at his directness. "Just bring yourself, and maybe some stories about your grandchildren. Sarah loves hearing about kids, and it might help her see you as a grandfather figure instead of a threat to her inheritance." "Linda," he said, his voice growing serious, "how are you feeling about all this? I know things have been complicated with your family." It was such a Robert question, focusing on my emotional state rather than the logistics of family dynamics. "I'm cautiously optimistic," I said honestly. "Sarah seems genuinely different, like she's finally growing up. But I'm also protecting myself from expecting too much too fast." "That's wise," he said. "Healing takes time, and trust has to be rebuilt slowly. But I'm proud of you for setting boundaries while still leaving room for relationship repair." That evening, I was reading in the living room when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Jessica's number, and I debated whether to answer. Our last conversation had ended with her hanging up on me when I refused to reconsider my estate planning decisions. "Hello, Jessica," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Mom, I owe you an apology," she said without preamble. "A real one this time." I set down my book and gave her my full attention. "I'm listening." "I've been talking to a therapist about what happened, about why we thought it was okay to tie you to a chair, and she helped me understand some things about myself that I didn't want to face." This was unexpected. Jessica had always been resistant to the idea of therapy, claiming she could handle her own problems without outside help. She helped me see that I've been treating you like you exist to serve my emotional and financial needs instead of treating you like a person with your own needs and desires. And that's not love, Mom. That's not even close to love. I felt tears starting to form. This was the acknowledgement I'd been waiting for, the recognition that their behavior had been fundamentally wrong regardless of their intentions. She also helped me understand that I'm angry at Dad for dying and leaving us, but I've been taking that anger out on you for moving on with your life, which is completely unfair and something I need to work on in therapy, not something I should be making your problem. The insight was profound and painful. I'd suspected that my children's resistance to my relationship with Robert was tied up in their unresolved grief about their father, but hearing Jessica articulate it was both validating and heartbreaking. "I'm proud of you for getting help," I said softly. "That takes courage." "Mom, I know I have a lot of work to do to earn back your trust, and I know that might take years, or it might never happen completely. But I want you to know that I'm committed to doing the work, not because I want back into your will, but because I want back into your life." "Jessica, that means everything to me." "There's one more thing," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I'd like to meet Robert properly, not to interrogate him or test him, but to get to know the person who makes my mother happy. Would you be willing to arrange that?" 2 weeks later, I found myself in Patricia Williams' office for what I hoped would be my final appointment regarding family legal protections. The past month had brought genuine changes in my relationships with Sarah and Jessica, though I was still proceeding cautiously. "How are things going with your children?" Patricia asked, reviewing the file she'd built around my case. "Better," I said. "Sarah and Robert have become quite fond of each other. She's even asked him to photograph her and her new boyfriend for her portfolio. And Jessica had lunch with us last weekend. She actually apologized to Robert directly for how she'd treated him." "That's encouraging," Patricia said. "But I want to remind you that people can change their behavior temporarily to achieve a goal. Real change is sustained over time, especially when there's no immediate reward for the new behavior." It was good advice. Patricia had seen enough family manipulation cases to know that abusers often went through periods of reformed behavior before reverting to old patterns. "I've been thinking about that," I said, "which is why I want to keep the current estate planning in place for now. If my children maintain these changes for at least 2 years, I might consider modest adjustments, but the basic structure stays the same." "I think that's wise," Patricia agreed. "It protects you from being manipulated by temporary good behavior while still leaving room for genuine relationship repair." We spent another hour reviewing my documents and discussing the upcoming wedding. Robert and I had decided to keep our December courthouse ceremony as planned, small and intimate. Sarah would be attending as my witness, and Jessica had asked if she could take photographs of the event as a gift to us. Michael was still working on rebuilding our relationship, but he'd sent a card congratulating us on our engagement with a note that seemed genuinely happy for my newfound joy. It was progress, even if it was slow. As I left Patricia's office, I felt a sense of closure that had been missing for months. My legal protections were in place, my boundaries were established, and my children were learning to treat me with respect instead of entitlement. Not because they had to, but because they were choosing to grow into better people. The day before Robert and I were scheduled to sign our marriage license, I woke up to find a large envelope that had been slipped under my front door. Inside was a handwritten letter from Michael, 3 pages long, with his careful engineer's handwriting covering every line. "Dear Mom," it began, "I know I haven't been good at talking about feelings, but I wanted you to know how sorry I am for everything that led up to that terrible morning in October. Not just the physical restraint, but all the ways I've made you feel like your value to me was financial instead of personal." The letter went on to detail his recognition of how his prolonged stay in my basement had been unfair, how his attitude toward Robert had been selfish, and how his assumptions about my capabilities had been condescending. But more than that, it was filled with memories of our relationship that had nothing to do with money or inheritance. He wrote about the time I'd driven 3 hours to bring him homemade soup when he was sick in college, about how I'd attended every one of his high school basketball games, even the away games in other towns, about the way I'd listened without judgment when his marriage fell apart, offering comfort instead of advice unless he specifically asked for guidance. "You've been an incredible mother," he wrote, "and I've been a terrible son lately. Not because I don't love you, but because I forgot how to love you properly. Robert is a lucky man, and I hope someday I can tell him that in person without feeling like I'm betraying Dad's memory." The letter ended with a promise to work on himself, to build his own life instead of depending on mine, and to support my happiness even when it made him uncomfortable. It was the most emotionally mature communication I'd ever received from my middle child. That afternoon, Robert and I met at the courthouse to finalize our marriage license paperwork. As we sat in the clerk's office answering routine questions about our previous marriages and current addresses, I thought about how different this felt from my first wedding 30 years ago. Then, I'd been 28 years old, full of dreams, about the future, but naive about the work required to build a lasting partnership. I'd been focused on the wedding day itself, the dress and flowers and celebration, rather than the daily choice to love someone through all of life's complications. Now, at 58, I understood that love wasn't just a feeling, but a decision renewed every day. Robert and I had already weathered the crisis of my children's opposition, the legal complexities of blending later life assets, and the emotional challenge of honoring our late spouses while building something new together. "Any second thoughts?" Robert asked quietly as we waited for our paperwork to be processed. "Only about the timing," I said, taking his hand. "I wish we'd met sooner so we could have had more years together." He squeezed my fingers gently. "I think we met exactly when we were supposed to, when we were both ready to appreciate what we have instead of grieving what we've lost." The wedding itself was small and perfect. Sarah served as my witness, taking photographs throughout the ceremony with tears streaming down her face. Jessica had helped me choose a simple blue dress that made me feel elegant without trying to recapture my 20s. Even Michael showed up, standing in the back of the courtroom with a small bouquet of flowers and a shy smile. Robert and I exchanged vows we'd written ourselves, promising to support each other's independence while building a life together, to honor our past relationships while creating new traditions, and to face whatever challenges remained with honesty and humor. When the judge pronounced us married, I felt something settle into place that had been missing for 5 years. Not just romantic love, though that was certainly present, but a sense of completeness that came from being chosen for who I was rather than what I could provide. At the small reception afterward at my favorite restaurant, my children presented us with a gift they'd collaborated on. It was a photo album Sarah had created, filled with pictures of Robert and me from the past 8 months, along with handwritten notes from each of them. Jessica's note read, "Thank you for showing us what healthy love looks like. We're sorry it took us so long to recognize it." Michael's note said, "Welcome to the family, Robert. Thank you for taking care of our mom the way she deserves." Sarah's note was the longest. "Mom, watching you choose happiness over our approval taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is disappoint people who have unrealistic expectations. I hope I'm half as brave as you when I'm faced with difficult choices." 6 months after our wedding, I was gardening in the backyard when I heard familiar voices coming from the kitchen. Sarah and Jessica had started stopping by on Saturday mornings, not to ask for anything, but to drink coffee and catch up on each other's lives. "Linda's in the garden," I heard Robert tell them. "She's been out there since sunrise, convinced she can grow tomatoes better than the farmer's market." I smiled at the affectionate teasing in his voice. Robert had quickly learned that my gardening ambitions far exceeded my gardening skills. But he supported my efforts anyway, even helping me research proper soil amendments and watering schedules. "How's the new apartment treating you?" I heard Jessica ask Sarah. "I love it," Sarah replied. "It's small, but it's mine. I never realized how good it would feel to pay my own rent and buy my own groceries." These Saturday morning conversations had become one of my favorite parts of the week. My daughters were building adult relationships with each other and with me, sharing their struggles and successes instead of just their financial needs. Michael had become a regular Sunday dinner guest, often bringing his new girlfriend, whom he'd met at a photography class Sarah had recommended. Watching my son build a healthy romantic relationship while respecting my choices had been one of the unexpected joys of this entire experience. "Mrs. Morrison?" I heard a young voice call from the front yard. I looked up to see my neighbor's 10-year-old daughter, Emma, standing at the garden gate with a small envelope in her hand. "Hi, Emma. What's that you have there?" My mom said, "To give this to you. It's a thank you card for helping her with her taxes last week." I wiped my dirt-covered hands on my gardening apron and accepted the card. Inside was a handwritten note from Emma's mother, thanking me for spending an evening helping her understand her small business deductions. At the bottom, Emma had drawn a picture of me surrounded by flowers with the words, "Thank you for being nice," written in her careful second-grade handwriting. This was what my life looked like now. Meaningful work that helped people navigate financial challenges. A marriage built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Children who were learning to be adults instead of perpetual dependents. Neighbors who saw me as a helpful community member rather than just someone to call when they needed something. As I walked back toward the house, I could hear laughter coming from the kitchen. Robert was telling one of his stories about his volunteer work at the Veterans Center, probably the one about the 90-year-old former Marine who'd decided to learn computer programming. My daughters were genuinely engaged, asking questions and offering their own experiences. This was what family was supposed to sound like. People who enjoyed each other's company, who were interested in each other's lives, who supported each other's growth instead of trying to control each other's choices. I thought about that terrible morning in October when I'd woken up tied to a chair in my own kitchen, surrounded by 3 adults who claimed to love me but treated me like property, to be managed. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone who'd been so afraid of losing her children's love that she'd forgotten she deserved to be loved properly. The legal documents Patricia had helped me prepare were still in place, still protecting my autonomy and my assets. But more importantly, I didn't need them anymore. My children had learned to love me without trying to own me, and I'd learned to set boundaries without cutting people off entirely. Robert appeared in the garden doorway, holding a fresh cup of coffee and wearing the gentle smile that had first caught my attention at the farmer's market all those months ago. "Your daughters are planning a surprise birthday party for you," he said, settling beside me on the garden bench. I probably wasn't supposed to tell you that. I won't let on that I know, I promised, leaning into his warmth. Though I have to say, the fact that they want to celebrate me instead of just enduring my presence feels like a miracle. It's not a miracle, Robert said, kissing the top of my head. It's the natural result of a woman finally demanding to be treated with the respect she's always deserved. As the sun set over our small corner of Green Bay, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. Sometimes the people who claim to love you have to lose access to you before they can learn to love you properly. Sometimes you have to tie up their future with legal documents before they understand that your future belongs to you. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, they learn to choose love over control, respect over possession, and your happiness over their comfort. The woman who'd been tied to a chair had become the woman who chose herself, and in choosing herself, she'd finally become someone worth choosing. 1 year later, I was sitting in my favorite coffee shop downtown, grading papers for the financial literacy class I'd started teaching at the community college, when a young woman approached my table with tears in her eyes. She was maybe 30, professionally dressed, but her hands were shaking as she clutched a manila folder. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly. "Are you Linda Morrison, the woman who spoke at the Women's Empowerment Conference last month?" I nodded, setting down my red pen and giving her my full attention. Over the past year, speaking about my experience had become an unexpected part of my life. What started as a single presentation at Patricia's law firm had grown into regular talks at community centers, support groups, and conferences across Wisconsin. "I'm Angela," she said, sliding into the chair across from me. "I was in your audience when you talked about setting boundaries with adult children. Your story. It could have been my story. Except my kids haven't tied me to a chair yet." The word "yet" hung heavy between us, and I recognized the exhaustion in her voice that came from years of being treated like a resource rather than a person. "Tell me what's happening," I said gently, closing my gradebook and focusing entirely on her. Angela's story poured out in a rush of words and emotions. 2 adult sons who lived in her basement rent-free while working part-time jobs and spending their money on entertainment. A daughter who called only when she needed financial help for various crises that seemed to occur with suspicious regularity. A ex-husband who had left her feeling worthless, and children who had learned to exploit. That insecurity? "They don't listen when I try to talk to them about getting their own places," Angela said, wiping her eyes with a napkin. "They just say they're saving money, or the job market is tough, or they need more time to get established. But it's been 3 years since my youngest graduated college, and nothing has changed except they've gotten more comfortable treating me like their personal bank." I listened to her describe the elaborate justifications her children had created for their dependence, the way they'd made her feel selfish for wanting her own space, the guilt they laid on thick whenever she suggested they needed to become truly independent. It was like listening to my own story being told by someone else. "What finally made you realize you needed to change something?" I asked. Angela opened the manila folder and pulled out a stack of papers. "Last week, I found these in my son's room. He'd been researching my credit score, my home value, and my retirement accounts. He was calculating how much money he'd have access to if something happened to me. He wasn't worried about my health or my happiness. He was doing financial projections on my death. The coldness of it took my breath away. I thought my children's duct tape intervention had been cruel, but Angela's son had been treating her mortality as a business opportunity. "Have you talked to a lawyer?" I asked. "That's why I wanted to find you," she said. "I called the law office you mentioned in your speech, but I wanted to ask you directly. Did your children really change? Or do they just act differently now because they know you have legal protection?" It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself as I watched my own family dynamics evolve. True change versus performance change was sometimes hard to distinguish, especially in the early stages. Some changes were immediate because they had to be. I said honestly. My son moved out within 30 days because he had no choice. The financial boundaries I set were enforced by legal documentation, so those took effect right away. But the deeper changes, the ones in how they see me and treat me, those took longer, and they're still ongoing. Angela leaned forward, hungry, for hope that real transformation was possible. Sarah, my youngest, was the first to genuinely change. She got tired of feeling like a perpetual child and started building an actual adult life. Jessica, my oldest, needed therapy to understand why she'd been so controlling. That took almost 6 months of weekly sessions before she could even acknowledge what she'd done wrong. And your son. Michael was the slowest to change, but when he finally did, it was the most complete transformation. He wrote me a letter, acknowledging everything he'd put me through, and then he backed up his words with actions. He's been consistently respectful and independent for over a year now. Angela nodded, taking notes on a small pad she'd pulled from her purse. How do you tell the difference between real change and manipulation? I thought about Patricia's warnings, about the cycles of behavior I'd observed in my own children, about the difference between compliance and genuine growth. Real change happens even when there's no immediate benefit, I said. Sarah didn't start treating me better because she thought it would get her back into my will. She started treating me better because she realized she was becoming someone she didn't like. Real change is consistent over time, even when you're not watching or when there's no reward for good behavior. We talked for another hour, and I helped Angela contact Patricia's office to schedule a consultation. As she gathered her papers and prepared to leave, she paused and looked at me with something like wonder. "You seem so happy," she said. I mean, genuinely happy. Not like you're trying to convince yourself you made the right choices, but actually content with your life. I smiled, thinking about the evening ahead. Robert and I were trying a new recipe for dinner, and then we were going to work in the garden together while listening to the jazz playlist he'd created for our outdoor evenings. Simple pleasures that had become precious because I was finally free to enjoy them. I am happy, I said. For the first time in years, I'm living my own life instead of managing everyone else's emotions about my choices. After Angela left, I finished grading my papers and drove home through the familiar streets of Green Bay. The trees were beginning to show their spring colors, and I found myself looking forward to planting the flower garden Robert and I had been planning all winter. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed an unfamiliar car parked in front of my house. As I walked toward the front door, a woman about my age got out of the vehicle and approached me with a hesitant smile. Mrs. Morrison, I'm Carol Stevens. My daughter attended your talk at the community center in Appleton last week, and she gave me your address. I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced. I'd grown accustomed to people seeking me out after my presentations, though usually they contacted me through Patricia's office or the community center coordinators. There was something urgent in Carol's manner that made me invite her inside, despite the unexpected nature of her visit. I'm desperate, she said once we were seated in my living room. My 3 adult children have been systematically taking over my life since my husband died 2 years ago. They've convinced me to sign over power of attorney, they've moved into my house, and they're making decisions about my medical care without consulting me. The situation she described was far more serious than what I'd experienced. While my children had been manipulative and controlling, they hadn't achieved legal control over my affairs. Carol was describing a form of elder abuse that could have devastating consequences. Carol, this sounds like a situation that requires immediate legal intervention, I said carefully. Have you spoken with an attorney about reversing the power of attorney documents? That's the problem, she said, tears starting to flow. They told me that if I try to change anything, they'll have me declared incompetent. They've been documenting every time I forget where I put my keys or mix up an appointment time. They're building a case that I'm not capable of managing my own affairs. The calculated cruelty of it made my stomach turn. My children had been selfish and entitled, but Carol's children were systematically destroying her autonomy and preparing to steal her independence entirely. "Do you have any allies?" I asked. "Friends, other family members, neighbors who could testify to your competence?" My sister in Florida, but she's too far away to help day to day. My children have isolated me from most of my friends, claiming they're worried about people taking advantage of me. I feel like I'm disappearing, like I'm becoming invisible in my own life. I thought about Angela's situation earlier that morning, about the dozens of women who had approached me after various presentations, about the epidemic of adult children who had learned to see their aging parents as assets to be managed rather than people to be loved. "Carol, I want you to call this number right now," I said, writing down Patricia's direct line. "Tell her I referred you and that this is an emergency situation. She has experience with cases like yours, and she'll know how to protect you legally. But what if my children find out I'm talking to a lawyer? What if they follow through on their threat to have me declared incompetent?" Competency evaluations require medical evidence, not just examples of normal aging forgetfulness, I said. "And if your children are threatening you with legal action to prevent you from seeking legal help, that's actually evidence of their manipulative behavior, not your incompetence." I spent the next 2 hours helping Carol document the timeline of her children's controlling behavior, compile a list of witnesses who could testify to her mental acuity, and prepare for her meeting with Patricia. By the time she left my house, she had a plan, and more importantly, she had hope. That evening, as Robert and I worked in the garden together, I told him about my day. He listened thoughtfully, occasionally asking questions or offering insights from his own work with veterans who had been exploited by family members. "It's interesting how your story has become a beacon for other women in similar situations," he said, carefully transplanting tomato seedlings into larger pots. "You've created something meaningful out of a terrible experience." "I never intended to become an advocate," I said, deadheading the early spring flowers we'd planted the month before. "I just wanted to protect myself from my own children. But it seems like there are a lot of us out there, women who raised kids who learned to see us as resources instead of people." Robert paused in his work and looked at me seriously. "Do you think there's something about how that generation was raised that contributed to this? Some message they received about entitlement or expectations?" It was a question I'd been grappling with as I heard more and more stories like mine. Was this a broader cultural problem, or just a collection of individual family dysfunctions? "I think we gave them too much without requiring enough in return," I said slowly. "We wanted to give them better lives than we'd had, but somewhere along the way, better became easier, and easier became entitled." We worked in comfortable silence for a while, the evening air filled with the sounds of birds and the distant laughter of children playing in neighboring yards. This was the life I'd fought for, the simple pleasure of spending time with someone who loved me without agenda or expectation. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. "Dinner Sunday? I'm making your famous lasagna recipe. Michael and his girlfriend want to come too." I smiled and showed the message to Robert. Sunday dinners had become a family tradition again, but now they happened at my children's homes instead of mine. They planned the meals, did the cooking, and cleaned up afterward. I attended as an honored guest rather than the unpaid caterer. "Should I bring dessert?" Robert texted back from his own phone. He'd developed a friendship with my children that was independent of his relationship with me, something that had surprised all of us. "Only if you bring your famous apple crisp," Sarah replied immediately. "Jessica's bringing wine, and Mom just has to bring herself." The ease of the exchange, the genuine affection in the planning, the way my children now competed to host rather than to be hosted, all of it represented a fundamental shift in our family dynamics. They had learned to give instead of just take, to consider my preferences instead of just managing my choices. Later that evening, I was reading in bed when Robert came up from his home office with a serious expression. "I just got off the phone with my son in Denver," he said, sitting on the edge of the bed. He wanted to know if I thought he should be concerned about me remarrying at my age. I felt a familiar tension creep up my spine. Robert's children had been politely supportive of our relationship, but I'd always wondered if they harbored similar concerns about their father's late-in-life romance. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "I told him that I was concerned about him calling to question my judgment instead of calling to wish me happiness," Robert said with a slight smile. "And I told him that if he wanted to discuss my personal life, he could invite both of us to dinner and get to know the woman I married." The contrast between Robert's response and my own historical people-pleasing was stark. Where I had spent years trying to convince my children that my choices were acceptable, Robert simply stated his boundaries and left the relationship repair work to them. How did he react to that? He was quiet for a long time, and then he said he hadn't thought about it from that perspective. He apologized and asked if you and I would be willing to visit Denver this summer so he could get to know you properly. This was what healthy family dynamics looked like. A brief misunderstanding, a direct conversation, an immediate correction, and a genuine effort to repair and improve the relationship. No manipulation, no threats, no attempts to control outcomes through emotional blackmail. "I'd love to visit Denver," I said, reaching for his hand. "And I'm proud of you for setting that boundary immediately, instead of letting resentment build up over time." "I learned from watching you," he said, squeezing my fingers gently. "Watching you stand up to your children taught me that love doesn't require accepting disrespect, even from family." The next morning brought a call from Patricia with an update on Carol Stevens' situation. Working with a local advocate for seniors, they had managed to get Carol's power of attorney documents reviewed by a judge who had found evidence of coercion and fraud in how they'd been obtained. Her children are facing potential criminal charges, Patricia told me, and Carol has been granted emergency protection while we sort out the legal mess they created. She wanted me to thank you for encouraging her to seek help. "How is she doing emotionally?" I asked. "Better than expected. She's staying with her sister in Florida while we handle the legal proceedings, and she told me yesterday that she feels like herself again for the first time in 2 years. She's even talking about staying in Florida permanently and starting over down there." The idea of starting over at Carol's age was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Inspiring because it showed that it's never too late to reclaim your life. Heartbreaking because she'd lost so much time to her children's manipulation. "Patricia, how common are cases like Carol's? Is this an epidemic we're not talking about?" "More common than most people realize," she said grimly. "Financial abuse of elderly parents by their adult children is one of the fastest growing forms of elder abuse. But it's often invisible because the victims are ashamed to admit that their own children are exploiting them." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen thinking about the ripple effects of the choice I'd made that October morning when I woke up tied to a chair. Not just in my own life, but in the lives of women like Angela and Carol who had found the courage to seek help. After hearing my story, I thought about the financial literacy classes I was teaching, where I regularly encountered women who had been excluded from their own financial decision-making by well-meaning but controlling family members. I thought about the support group I'd started at the community center for women dealing with manipulative adult children. What had begun as an effort to protect myself had evolved into something larger, a recognition that family dysfunction often disguised itself as family devotion, and that love without respect was just another form of abuse. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway. "Mrs. Morrison, this is Detective Sarah Martinez with the Green Bay Police Department. I know this might sound strange, but I was wondering if you'd be willing to consult on a case we're working." The request was indeed strange, and I told her so. We have a situation involving an elderly woman whose adult children have been restricting her movement and controlling her finances. She mentioned your name when we interviewed her, said she'd heard you speak about similar experiences. Would you be willing to talk with her? The fact that my story was reaching people through law enforcement channels was something I hadn't expected, but it made sense. Police officers were often the first responders to domestic situations involving elder abuse, but they might not always recognize the subtle forms of family manipulation. Of course, I said. When would you like me to come in? 2 hours later, I was sitting in a conference room at the police station, talking with Detective Martinez and a woman named Helen who was 73 years old and had been virtual prisoner in her own home for 6 months. Her story was familiar but unique, like fingerprints of dysfunction that shared common patterns while maintaining individual details. My daughter took my car keys, Helen explained, claiming I wasn't safe to drive anymore after I got confused about directions to the grocery store one time, but I think she just wanted to control where I could go and who I could see. The daughter had also taken over Helen's bank accounts, moved into her house claiming she needed to provide supervision, and gradually isolated her from friends and outside activities. It was a textbook case of financial and emotional abuse, disguised as concerned caregiving. The interesting thing is, Detective Martinez said, Helen's daughter claims everything she's doing is for her mother's protection. She has documentation of Helen's forgetfulness, medical appointments where she's expressed concern about her mother's cognitive abilities, and witnesses who will testify that she's a devoted daughter. This was the challenge in cases of family manipulation. The perpetrators often genuinely believed they were acting in their victims' best interests, or they had become very skilled at presenting their control as caregiving. Helen, I said, how do you feel when your daughter makes decisions? For you without asking your opinion? Angry, she said immediately, and invisible, like I stopped being a person and became a problem to be managed. Those words resonated with something deep in my chest. That feeling of invisibility, of being seen as a problem rather than a person, was exactly what I'd experienced with my own children. Detective Martinez, I said, the key question isn't whether Helen occasionally forgets things or needs help with certain tasks. The key question is whether she's being allowed to make decisions about the help she receives and maintain control over the aspects of her life that she's still capable of managing. We spent the next hour helping Helen articulate the difference between wanting assistance and being forced to accept control. By the end of our conversation, she had a clear plan for reclaiming her independence while still accepting appropriate help with the tasks that had become genuinely difficult for her. As I drove home from the police station, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in just over a year. I'd gone from being someone who absorbed other people's dysfunction to someone who helped others recognize and escape similar patterns. That evening, Robert and I attended a dinner party at Sarah's apartment. She'd invited several of her friends from the photography studio, along with Michael and his girlfriend, and Jessica and her new boyfriend. It was the kind of social gathering I hadn't been able to imagine a year ago, when family interactions felt like navigating a minefield. Mom, Sarah said as we were clearing the dinner dishes, I have something I want to ask you. The familiar anxiety started to creep up my spine. The old conditioning that made me expect requests for money or favors whenever my children wanted to discuss something important. One of my friends at work is dealing with something similar to what we put you through, she continued. Her adult brother moved back home after his divorce, and he's basically taken over her mom's life. She's miserable, but she feels guilty about setting boundaries because he's family. I relaxed as I realized this wasn't about what Sarah needed from me, but about what she could give to someone else. Would you be willing to talk to her? She's heard me mention your advocacy work, and I think hearing from someone who's been through it might help her find the courage to make changes. Of course, I said. feeling proud of my daughter for recognizing a situation where her family's experience could help someone else. Have her call me anytime. As the evening wound down and we prepared to leave, I watched my children interact with their friends and romantic partners. They were confident, independent adults who contributed to conversations instead of just consuming attention. They paid their own bills, managed their own problems, and treated their relationships as partnerships rather than service agreements. This was what success as a parent actually looked like. Not children who never left home and never faced consequences, but adults who had learned to build their own lives while maintaining loving connections with family. "Penny for your thoughts," Robert said as we drove home through the quiet streets. "I was thinking about how proud I am of who my children have become," I said. "Not because they're finally treating me better, though that's wonderful, but because they're becoming people I actually enjoy spending time with." "That's the real measure of successful parenting," Robert agreed. "Raising people you'd choose to be friends with even if you weren't related to them." When we got home, I found an email waiting from Angela, the young woman I'd met at the coffee shop. She'd met with Patricia, implemented legal protections similar to mine, and given her adult children 30 days to find their own housing and financial independence. "I wanted to thank you for showing me that love doesn't require accepting disrespect," she wrote. "My children are angry right now, but I can already feel the relief of not managing their emotions anymore. For the first time in years, I'm making decisions based on what's best for me, not what's easiest for them." I forwarded the email to Patricia, who had become not just my lawyer, but a genuine friend. She was documenting the long-term outcomes of these family intervention cases, building a database that could help other legal professionals recognize and address similar situations. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about the woman who had woken up tied to a chair 15 months ago. She had been so afraid of losing her children's love that she'd forgotten what healthy love was supposed to feel like. She had been so focused on keeping peace that she'd lost sight of her own worth. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone I remembered with compassion but couldn't quite relate to anymore. The woman I'd become was stronger, clearer about her boundaries, and surrounded by people who loved her properly. My children had learned that real love meant wanting someone to be happy, even when their happiness required difficult changes in the relationship. Robert had shown me that partnership meant supporting each other's growth rather than managing each other's choices. And the women I'd met through my advocacy work had reminded me that courage was contagious, that one person's decision to demand respect could inspire others to do the same. The legal documents that protected my assets were still in place, still necessary as a safeguard against future manipulation. But more importantly, I no longer needed protection from my own family. We had rebuilt our relationships on foundations of mutual respect rather than financial dependence. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is disappoint people who have unrealistic expectations. Sometimes you have to tie up someone's future to untie your own. And sometimes, if you're very fortunate, everyone learns to choose love over control, respect over possession, and each other's happiness over their own comfort. The woman who had been tied to a chair had become the woman who refused to be tied down by anyone, for any reason, ever again. And in that refusal, she had finally found the love and respect she'd been seeking all along. 2 years later, I stood at the podium of the Milwaukee Convention Center, looking out at an audience of over 800 women who had gathered for the Midwest Conference on Family Financial Empowerment. The sea of faces staring back at me represented every age, ethnicity, and background imaginable, but I knew that many of them shared a common experience. They had been diminished, controlled, or exploited by the very people who claimed to love them most. 3 years ago, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. I woke up on a Tuesday morning to discover that my 3 adult children had tied me to a kitchen chair with duct tape because they disagreed with my decision to remarry. That morning changed everything, not just for me, but for hundreds of families across the Midwest who have since found the courage to demand better treatment from their own relatives. A murmur rippled through the audience, that collective intake of breath that happens when people recognize their own pain reflected in someone else's story. I had given this presentation dozens of times over the past 2 years, but it never got easier to describe that morning. The humiliation remained fresh, even though the woman who had experienced it felt like someone from another lifetime. The conference was the largest event I had ever addressed, organized by a coalition of women's advocacy groups, legal aid societies, and financial counseling organizations. What had started as informal talks at local community centers had evolved into a movement that was gaining national attention. Elder abuse through family financial manipulation was finally being recognized as the epidemic it had always been. In the front row, I spotted Dr. Rebecca Chen, a geriatric psychiatrist from the University of Wisconsin who had been documenting the psychological impacts of family financial abuse. Beside her sat Maria Gonzalez, a social worker who had developed intervention protocols now being used by protective services agencies across 3 states. These were the professionals who had turned my personal story into research data, policy recommendations, and systemic change. The most insidious aspect of family financial abuse, I continued, clicking to the next slide in my presentation, is that it's often disguised as love and concern. My children didn't see themselves as abusers. They saw themselves as protectors, saving their foolish mother from making a mistake that would cost them their inheritance. This self-deception is what makes family abuse so difficult to recognize and even harder to escape. After my presentation, the question and answer session lasted nearly an hour. Women shared stories that made my own experience seem almost mild by comparison. Adult children who had convinced elderly parents to sign over entire estates. Daughters-in-law who had systematically isolated their husbands' mothers from outside support systems. Sons who had used their mother's social security numbers to open credit accounts and accumulate debt in their names. But interspersed with these horror stories were tales of successful intervention and family healing. Women who had found the courage to seek legal help after hearing my story. Families who had rebuilt their relationships on foundations of respect rather than exploitation. Adult children who had recognized their own manipulative behavior and chosen to change. During the lunch break, I was approached by a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the National Institute on Aging. She had been taking notes throughout my presentation and wanted to discuss a research opportunity. We're launching a 5-year longitudinal study on family financial abuse and recovery, she explained, as we found a quiet corner of the conference center's lobby. We want to follow families through the intervention process and document what factors contribute to successful relationship repair versus permanent estrangement. The idea of contributing to academic research that could help other families was appealing, but I had learned to be cautious about requests that might exploit my story for others' professional advancement. What would my participation involve? I asked. Quarterly interviews about your family dynamics, updates on any legal or financial changes, and permission to contact your children for their perspectives on the recovery process. We're particularly interested in your case because you achieved reconciliation without completely cutting off contact. That evening, I called Robert from my hotel room to discuss the research opportunity. He had stayed home to tend our garden and care for his elderly father, who had recently moved into an assisted living facility near us. The irony wasn't lost on me that while I was speaking about elder abuse, my husband was demonstrating what healthy adult-child behavior actually looked like. "What's your gut feeling about it?" he asked after I explained Dr. Walsh's proposal. "I'm interested, but I want to make sure my children are comfortable with the level of scrutiny. We've come so far in rebuilding trust, and I don't want academics' research to feel like another form of judgment about their past behavior. Why don't you discuss it with them at Sunday dinner this weekend? Let them make their own decisions about whether they want to participate." This was vintage Robert, always thinking about how decisions affected other people while respecting everyone's autonomy to choose their own level of involvement. His approach to problem solving had taught me that consideration for others didn't require sacrificing your own needs, and that healthy relationships were built on informed consent rather than emotional manipulation. The flight home the next day gave me time to reflect on how dramatically my life had changed since that October morning when I had been physically restrained by my own children. The woman sitting in first class, flying home from a national conference, where she had been the keynote speaker, bore little resemblance to the woman who had once tiptoed around her own house to avoid upsetting her adult children's fragile sense of entitlement. When I arrived home, I found Robert in the kitchen preparing dinner, a routine we had established early in our marriage. He cooked on days when I traveled for speaking engagements, and I took over kitchen duties when he spent long days at the Veterans Center or visiting his father. This division of labor had emerged naturally from our respective schedules and preferences rather than from traditional gender expectations or unspoken obligations. "How was the conference?" he asked, wrapping me in a hug that smelled like garlic and herbs. "Overwhelming but encouraging," I said, settling onto a bar stool while he continued chopping vegetables for our salad. 800 women, and probably half of them had stories that were worse than mine. But the other half had stories of successful intervention and family healing. "Any interesting follow-up opportunities?" I told him about Dr. Walsh's research proposal, and we discussed the potential benefits and drawbacks while he finished preparing our meal. This was another aspect of our relationship that had taken me by surprise. Robert genuinely wanted to hear about my work and offered thoughtful perspectives without trying to make decisions for me. "There's something else," I said as we sat down to eat. "The conference organizers want me to write a book about family financial abuse. They think my story could reach a broader audience than speaking engagements alone." Robert paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. "How do you feel about that level of public exposure?" "Nervous, but excited. The speaking engagements have shown me how many people need to hear this message. A book could reach women who would never attend a conference or seek out a support group." "What about your children? How would they feel about having their story told in a published book?" This was the question I had been avoiding all day. My children had grudgingly accepted my speaking engagements as a form of therapy and advocacy, but a book would make their personal failures part of the permanent public record. Even though they had genuinely changed and rebuilt our relationships, having their worst behavior documented in print might feel like a betrayal. "I'd want their permission before moving forward," I said. "This story belongs to all of us, not just me." That Sunday, our family dinner was held at Michael's new house, a small but well-maintained cottage he had purchased 6 months earlier with money he had saved while living in his own apartment. The fact that he had invited us to see his first home as an independent adult felt symbolic of how far he had come from the angry young man who had helped tie me to a chair. His girlfriend Emma was there, along with Sarah and her boyfriend David, and Jessica with her fiancé Mark. The conversation around Michael's dining room table was easy and genuine, focused on their careers, travel plans, and shared memories that didn't revolve around money or my role as the family caretaker. After dinner, while the younger generation cleaned up and started a card game in the living room, I asked my children if we could talk privately. We gathered on Michael's back deck, and I explained both the research opportunity and the book proposal. "I want you to know that I won't participate in either project without your full consent," I said. "These are your stories too, and you have the right to decide how public you're comfortable making them." Jessica, who had initially been the most resistant to acknowledging her role in our family dysfunction, spoke first. "Mom, what happened between us was terrible, but it led to something important. Not just for our family, but for all the families you've helped since then." "I agree," Sarah added. "The speaking you've been doing has helped me understand that our behavior wasn't just wrong, it was part of a larger pattern that affects thousands of families. Maybe documenting that pattern could help prevent other people from making the same mistakes we made." Michael was quiet for a long time, staring out at his small backyard, where he had already started planting a vegetable garden. Finally, He looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I've been thinking about writing my own account of what happened," he said. "Not to excuse what we did, but to explain how 3 reasonably intelligent adults convinced themselves that tying their mother to a chair was an acceptable form of intervention. This was completely unexpected. Michael had always been the most private of my children, the least likely to share personal information with strangers or seek public attention. I think other adult children need to understand how easy it is to slide from concern into control," he continued. "We didn't wake up one morning and decide to abuse you. We gradually convinced ourselves that we knew better than you did about your own life, and we justified increasingly invasive behavior as protection rather than manipulation." The maturity and self-awareness in his words brought tears to my eyes. This was the son I had raised, the thoughtful young man who had been buried under years of entitlement and poor boundaries. His willingness to examine his own behavior publicly demonstrated a level of personal growth that I had hoped for but never demanded. "So you'd all be comfortable with me moving forward with both the research study and the book project?" "On one condition," Jessica said. "We want to be involved in the writing process, not to control what you say about us, but to add our perspectives on how the recovery process worked and what we learned from it. And we want any proceeds from the book to go toward funding programs that help other families in similar situations," Sarah added. "This shouldn't be about profiting from our mistakes, but about using our experience to create resources for other people." The generosity and wisdom of their suggestions overwhelmed me. These were not the same people who had once seen my story as something that belonged to them to control. They had become adults who understood that sharing painful experiences could serve a greater good. 6 months later, I was sitting in Patricia's law office, reviewing the contracts for both the research study and the book deal. The legal protections that had once been necessary to shield me from my own children were now being used to ensure that our collaborative storytelling project protected everyone involved. The publisher is particularly interested in the family recovery aspect, Patricia explained, flipping through the contract pages. Most books about family abuse focus on escape and estrangement. Yours will be one of the first to document successful relationship repair. Do you think that's misleading? I asked. Not every family situation can be repaired. Some relationships are too damaged to save. That's exactly why your story is important, she said. It shows what genuine change looks like versus surface-level compliance. Readers will be able to identify whether their own family members are capable of real growth or just performance improvement. The book writing process took almost a year and involved multiple interviews with each family member, sessions with a professional editor who specialized in family memoirs, and careful fact-checking to ensure accuracy while protecting everyone's privacy. My children's perspectives on our shared experience were both illuminating and humbling. Jessica wrote about the therapy process that had helped her understand how her need to control others stemmed from feeling powerless in her own life. Michael described the shame he felt when he realized that his financial dependence on me had corrupted his ability to see me as a separate person with my own needs. Sarah explored how her role as the family baby had delayed her emotional development and made her resistant to accepting adult responsibilities. But the most powerful sections of the book were their descriptions of what healthy family relationships felt like compared to the manipulative dynamics we had previously accepted as normal. They wrote about learning to offer help without expecting, gratitude, to express concern without demanding control, and to love someone without trying to own them. The book was published 18 months after that conversation on Michael's back deck, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. Within a week of its release, I was receiving dozens of emails daily from readers who recognized their own families in our story. Some were adult children who had been confronted with their own controlling behavior. Others were parents who had finally found the language to describe what they had been experiencing. But the most meaningful responses came from families who were actively working to repair relationships damaged by financial manipulation and control. These readers shared updates on their progress, setbacks, and breakthrough moments, creating an informal community of people committed to building healthier family dynamics. 3 months after the book's publication, I received a call that would change the trajectory of my advocacy work entirely. The caller identified herself as Congresswoman Maria Santos from California, chair of the House Subcommittee on Aging and Long-Term Care. Mrs. Morrison, I read your book last month, and I believe your experience highlights a gap in our current elder protection laws. Would you be willing to testify before Congress about the need for stronger legal remedies for family financial abuse? The idea of speaking before Congress was both terrifying and exhilarating. This was an opportunity to influence policy at the federal level, to help create legal frameworks that could protect other families from experiencing what mine had endured. What kind of legislation are you considering? I asked. We're working on a bill that would require financial institutions to implement safeguards against family coercion, mandate training for law enforcement officers on recognizing family financial abuse, and create federal funding for legal aid programs that specialize in elder protection. 2 months later, I found myself in a hearing room in the Rayburn House office building, speaking into a microphone while members of Congress listened to my testimony about family financial abuse. The formal setting was intimidating, but the content of my message was the same one I had been sharing for 3 years. Love without respect is not love at all, and families must be held accountable for treating their members with basic human dignity. During the question period following my testimony, I was asked about the role of adult children in caring for aging parents and how to balance protection with autonomy. The key, I said, looking directly at the subcommittee members, is to understand that protection means creating safety for someone to make their own decisions, not making decisions for them. My children thought they were protecting me from a bad choice, but what they were actually doing was protecting themselves from losing control over outcomes that were never theirs to control. The hearing was covered by several major news outlets, and the resulting media attention brought national focus to an issue that had previously been addressed only at the local level. Within 6 months, similar hearings were being held in state legislatures across the country, and elder advocacy groups were using our story as a framework for developing intervention protocols. But the most satisfying outcome of the increased public attention was the ripple effect it created in individual families. I regularly received messages from adult children who had recognized their own behavior in our story and chosen to change their approach to their aging parents. These were the victories that mattered most. Families healing before reaching the crisis point that had been necessary in our case. As I sat in Robert's and my living room 5 years after that terrible October morning, surrounded by copies of the book that had grown out of our pain, letters from families who had found healing through our story, and photographs from the various speaking engagements and advocacy events that had become central to my life, I marveled at the unexpected trajectory my life had taken. The woman who had once been afraid to disappoint her own children had become someone who challenged families across the country to examine their own dynamics and make difficult changes. The woman who had accepted disrespect to maintain peace had become an advocate for the radical idea that love requires respect and respect requires boundaries. My children, who had once seen me as an obstacle to their financial security, now introduced me to their friends as someone they were proud to know. They attended my speaking engagements, contributed to my advocacy work, and used their own experiences to help other families recognize and address similar problems. Robert, who had entered my life during the darkest period of family dysfunction, had become not just my husband, but my partner in building something meaningful from our shared experience. His steady support and clear boundaries had shown me what healthy love looked like, and his own relationship with his children provided a constant model of how family members could care for each other without trying to control each other. The legal documents that Patricia had helped me create were still in place, still serving as important protections, but they were no longer the primary safeguards for my autonomy. The real protection came from the relationships I had built with people who understood that loving someone meant wanting them to be happy, not wanting to manage their happiness. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I had never found the courage to seek legal help, if I had continued to accept my children's control as an expression of love, if I had married Robert in secret to avoid their disapproval instead of demanding that they respect my choices. But those alternative timelines felt like stories about someone else. The woman I had become was someone who understood that courage was contagious, that one person's refusal to accept mistreatment could inspire hundreds of others to demand better, and that the most profound form of love was helping people learn to love properly. The journey from victim to advocate had not been easy or quick, but it had been transformative in ways I could never have imagined when I was tied to that kitchen chair. What had begun as a desperate attempt to protect myself from my own children had evolved into a mission to help other families build relationships based on mutual respect rather than control and manipulation. And in helping others find their own courage to demand better treatment, I had discovered that the woman who had been tied to a chair had always possessed the strength to break free. She had just needed to remember that she deserved to be untied. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.